Friday, I was a policy manager at the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative at UCSF. In a few weeks, I'm going to be the policy director at California YIMBY. I'm joined here by a man who I think if you're on housing Twitter probably needs no introduction at all, Darrell Owens. And then we've got Tiffani McCoy coming in via Zoom. And we're here to talk about social housing, which for those of you who are unfamiliar is a form of publicly or managed by a nonprofit housing, mixed income. There are a lot of different models for how it could work, and we're going to talk about some of those models. So I'm going to get out of the way of the presenters now and let Darrell take it away with a few opening remarks, followed by Tiffani.
Yeah. Is this on? Hello? Oh, okay. There we go. Hi. Yeah. I am Darrell Owens. As mentioned earlier, a bit of a Twitter e-celeb. Completely unintentionally. That's not where I envisioned myself a couple years ago. But what happens, happens. Yeah, I am a policy analyst for California YIMBY. I do a lot of data work. I also write a blog on Substack called the Discourse Lounge, in which I like to talk about our housing wars and discussions about housing in California and abroad. I'm also, I always considered myself first and foremost a transportation activist. Housing was somewhat incidental, but I began to realize that housing and transportation are a lot more closely linked than most people realize. And I worked a lot on, advancing public transit in the Bay Area. I started a transit union. I, of course, was one of the founders of the first proposal to remove police from traffic enforcement in the United States, along with other various transportation policies. I have led many pro-housing movements in the Bay Area, particularly in Berkeley, California. I now live in Santa Cruz, but I hope to be back soon. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here.
All right, and Tiffani McCoy is the advocacy director at the street newspaper Real Change in Seattle, Washington. She is also the co-chair of the House Our Neighbors Coalition, which has filed an initiative in the city of Seattle to create the Seattle Social Housing Developer for the November 2022 ballot. And of course, as those of you coming from California probably know, Darrell is involved in the push to pass AB 2053, which is the social housing bill in California. So now I'll kick it over to Tiffani for any opening remarks.
Yeah, right on. It's nice to be here. I apologize. I couldn't get childcare coverage for last night. Otherwise, I would be there in person. But appreciate you having me. And Darrell, it's really rad to meet you through the screen. I wish that I could have met you in person. Love how you write, and it's cool to be able to have these two West Coast campaigns that are ongoing. So yeah, I work at Real Change for folks from Portland. We're a street paper just like Street Roots is, but we are the one that's in Seattle. And so we provide a low barrier employment opportunity to anyone who wants it. The vendors who sell the newspaper are folks that are unhoused, formerly unhoused, currently unhoused, or very, very low income. And also we have a good amount of veterans as well. So we created the House Our Neighbors Coalition as a political committee of Real Change last year to fight back against a barbaric charter amendment that would have codified sweeps as a cornerstone of our homelessness policy in the city of Seattle. And they grossly called it Compassion Seattle. I think that there's something very similar that's being proposed or maybe on the ballot already for November in Portland. And I hope folks organize against that. We can't criminalize our way out of our deep need for affordable housing. So that's how the House Our Neighbors Coalition started, was successfully getting that kicked off the ballot. We decided we needed to really focus on how we have this tremendous housing affordability crisis. And while there are really great efforts happening at different levels of government to address this, none of them are going to get to the scale of the need So we set out on a grassroots path to look at all of these other successful models internationally of social housing and come up with our own initiative. And I'm excited to talk about that and social housing in general throughout this panel.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. And Darrell, do you have anything you wanted to add about the AB 2053 effort?
We're gonna get into that, right?
Oh yeah, sure.
Is this the time for that now? I can go into that if you'd like.
Yeah.
I guess as a short preview, the proposal initiated by Alex Lee, who is from the South Bay of the Bay Area, is a Democratic Socialist member, youngest elected in the California Assembly, and co-authored by Buffy Wicks, who is the Oakland area East Bay Assembly member, proposes to establish a social housing agency, which is the byproduct of our work for the last couple years at East Bay for Everyone, which is the East Bay division of like YIMBY activism, where we, for a year or two, or maybe it was 3, I have a really bad sense of time, worked on models of how to make social housing work in the state of California. And of course, when we say social housing, what we really meant is like public housing that is mixed income. I actually really don't like that term, social housing. Not because I think it's a bad term, it's just so vague and it means a bajillion different things in a bajillion different places. But our vision of social housing in California is really public housing for everyone, which is in stark contrast to the public housing of old, as I'm sure we're going to get into very shortly.
Yeah, and I have one more question for each of you, but after that, I really wanted to open it up for audience questions. So the first one is for Tiffany. Because I think when people talk about social housing, a lot of times we're pointing to international models, in particular Vienna. But Vienna, I'm sure it's a great city, has limited application in a US context. And so, Tiffany, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about any US examples of social housing that you would look toward.
Yeah, and thanks for that question. That's also the way that like the right wing and bad faith naysayers will point to Vienna as the way that we could never achieve this. But it is happening right now in Montgomery County, Maryland. The past couple of years, under their county housing authority, they have a branch of social housing. And right now they're in construction of a 400-unit apartment building that meets passive house standards, which, as I'm sure most of you in the audience know, are some of the highest environmental standards for new buildings, making sure that like there's really strong ventilation for fire seasons and just generally for like all the pollution in the air. That's a model that we actually have put into our proposed initiative because we really can't keep kicking the can down the road on environmental standards in our housing. And we do live in a place of wildfire season, and that's not fun to admit, but we have to be real and live in reality. And wildfire season is going to get worse and worse. And our neighbors deserve to live in housing where they can breathe healthy air during these seasons. So that is happening in Montgomery County. They get a $3 million grant from the county government, and they're able to bond on future rents through that, and also to take out loans based on that. And they've leveraged it in a significant way to build up this model of social housing, which is, pulling housing out of the private market for the public good.
And then Darrell, just one more question for you. If you look at the endorsements of AB 2053, California YIMBY has endorsed it. Also, the organization Housing as a Human Right has endorsed it. That's a project of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which for those of you who aren't plugged into California housing politics, they're not our biggest fans, to say the least. So I wanted to ask you about kind of the strange bedfellows that can organize around social housing and how that comes about.
Yeah, so Housing as a Human Right is a organization that's ran by AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which is basically this organization run by this wealthy millionaire, I think billionaire, from Beverly Hills, who basically funds all the opposition against state land use housing reform. Every single zoning bill in the state of California that has major opposition against it is almost always from AIDS Healthcare Foundation. So it is rather funny that they are actually on the same team with us about social housing. But I will say, While I don't necessarily know what their motives are, I appreciate their support, and I appreciate the support of anyone who supports building more social, publicly subsidized housing in the state of California. The rationale behind it, I genuinely don't know, but I think that actually, as we'll get into shortly, that social housing, particularly this bill, has been somewhat of a good litmus test for determining who's serious and who's just using it as sort of vaporware, as we like to call it. And so this is really the sort of time is testing. This is the moment to see who's serious and who's not.
Yeah, and can I just get you to expand a little bit on that? What makes it such a good litmus test?
I mean, so the debate in the last couple years in California, especially as the popularity of YIMBYism and production-based policies have grown, is whether financing housing through the private market is the best way to do it. And the YIMBY, especially among sort of left-wing YIMBYs, the YIMBY mantra has always been that we need housing at all income levels of all subsidies and types, and that we don't want to be saying no to anything since everyone tends to live in every kind. And, you know, this has always been somewhat theoretical because we live in a system where our housing is almost exclusively financed by the private market, including even subsidized housing is financed through tax credits, the low-income tax credit system, which essentially is a form of government incentive, in which case benevolent private interests will help finance low-income housing. This is the aftermath of public housing, in which has been defunded by HUD. And so every single time you propose a zoning bill, you always get some, we like to call them left NIMBY, but whatever. You know, these kinds of people who come out and be like, no, we shouldn't do any new housing that's not social housing. And it's like, okay, well, maybe you're just sort of a rigid ideologue who's not living in reality, but like maybe you're actually serious about building lots of social housing. And since that's actually a goal of ours too, for reasons we'll get into because of the shortcomings of the private market, and not just in ways that people tend to think of it, this has been a good litmus test, because what we've learned is negotiating with tenant groups and organizers around housing justice and so on and so forth, a lot of universal interest in making this bill work. And that has shown to me that a lot of people were serious about a lot of their objections to upzoning, even if I don't agree with it, that they are genuine about their attempts to sort of revive public housing. And so this has been what's a really informative discussion. It has also been somewhat contentious. How do we do it? What does the funding models look like? What do the income strands and bands look like? This has been hard to determine. It has left a bill that is very aspirational, but is going to go through a lot of turbulence, no doubt about it, in the legislature. But this has been like a great moment, and thankfully we have awesome legislators like Alex Lee from the South Bay, who's just been leading the way on this stuff as a young Gen Z, millennial, whatever you want to call him, person who's a very left-wing and very YIMBY and very much has our aligned interests.
May I jump in on that too? I think what Darrell's saying about a litmus test is exactly right. Here in Seattle and even in broader King County, virtually every elected official, regardless of their ideological background, admits that we need more housing. We need more deeply affordable housing. So it will be interesting to see as the initiative rolls out and we start gathering signatures next week, which electeds actually endorse and support this and like get out there and mobilize for it, because this is something that is still newer in our country. But there are no like concrete plans to get to deeply affordable housing at scale at any level of government. And the affordable housing financing mechanisms that Darrell talked about, those are never meant to get up to scale of what we need. So yeah, the litmus test, absolutely. And we'll see how that pans out here too.
I'm going to ask one more question because I think Darrell kind of set it up in his response to my last question. And I'll ask Tiffany to answer this one first, I think. The YIMBY movement is an ideologically diverse movement, and some of the folks in this room might be more predisposed to support market-oriented approaches to increasing housing supply. And I was wondering if you could, since we've talked about why groups like Housing as a Human Right might support social housing, if I could get you to talk a little bit about why YIMBYs who tend to support encouraging the market to produce more housing should get behind social housing, and what gaps in the market-based approach does this fill?
Yeah, so here's where I show that I am not deeply knowledgeable of all of these terms. I know, I hear the gasps, but I know what YIMBY is and FIMBY and is it SHIMBY? Look, I've been working at Real Change for 5 years. We've been working mostly on homelessness, on sweeps, on more shelters, more transitional shelters. But we're really staking out a new territory and focusing on deeply affordable housing. As you talk to our vendors that sell the paper here, and what is the one thing that they need the most? They need housing that they can afford, that is reliable, that is safe, that is healthy, that they're not having to do a tremendous amount of paperwork to keep on top of. These vendors that are Real Change, they have an income and they need housing that fits their income. So that's what brought like Real Change and me to this fight, is that basic human need that is not being met by the market. And I don't know if anyone can say with a straight face, outside of like vast privilege, specifically like white privilege, that we can continue relying on the private market to solve this problem. That I would encourage you to just go speak to anyone that you see that is unhoused, buy them lunch and ask them if they have time to wait for the market to come up with a solution, because the answer is no. They'll laugh at you. And so that's what I would say to the market-based argument. Also, housing should not be a commodity. It is a human right. We need to enshrine it as such. And as I kind of went into earlier, we also need to stop kicking the can down the road on environmental standards in new buildings. So that's why we have passive house as a requirement for all new buildings. Any buildings that the public developer will acquire will need to be retrofitted to passive house standards. So, and also we enshrine in there that it should be built with union labor. Like for too long, under this scarcity mindset that is just shoved down our throats, there's this idea that you can never have green standards and have it be union built. Like those things can't coexist. We're just kind of like throwing that all out the window and like challenging individuals to like come up with a different proposal, because every year that goes by that we don't deeply address the affordability crisis is another year where more of our neighbors are pushed into homelessness. That is an irrefutable fact, because rents are rising disproportionately with wages. And then every year that goes by as well, more Black and brown and low-income communities are pushed out of the city of Seattle. So we don't have time to wait. We don't want this to become a city of like the super rich and those that are serving them in the service sector. So that's a long answer, but that's what I want to go into.
Go ahead.
Wait, what was the question?
The question was about what market inefficiencies does social housing address?
Right. So one of the things that is very criminally under-discussed in the housing debate and the housing discussion is the Great Recession. And we sort of treat this as some kind of bygone incident that happened 10 years ago or 12 years ago or whatever. But people really don't realize how much the Great Recession really changed how we do housing in the United States. If you look at the rate of home construction during the Great Recession, it essentially tanked. It went to the pit. And it really took up until like 2018, 2017, if you look at the Federal Reserve numbers, for home permitting rates to even catch up to like pre-recession levels. At the same time, it became a very explicit policy. It was always a policy, going back to the days of FHA. But it became a very explicit federal policy to not overproduce housing because there was a need to keep property values up at a time during the foreclosure crisis when so many homes were underwater. And this has been a major problem, a hindrance of our housing production. We built half as many homes in the 2010s as we did in the 2000s. And it is because it has become both federal policy and a lot of financial institutions' policies to shift away from producing too much housing and instead into buying existing housing and jacking up the property values as much as possible through a shortage of sorts. And I mean, this has been taught, I wrote about this in my Substack. You know, you see you were just talking about earlier on a previous panel, the issues of corporations buying housing. Well, they say in their own SEC files and documents that we are buying housing in areas where there's a huge housing shortage and the vacancy rates are low so that we can jack rents up. We're not stupid. It takes far less risk to be a landlord and to be a realtor than it is to be a developer. Developer carries a lot more risks than the other two institutions in real estate. Developers got to make a certain amount of money. They have so many divisions of labor and financiers that they have to pay back revenue to. They have to have a certain amount of profitability in order to guarantee a loan. All these things are much harder than just being a corporate company or a big LLC or whatever that just buys houses and rents it out and just waits. Because population growth is happening, whether you like it or not. And we had a whole new generation, millennials going into their home buying years when housing production was effectively done. And so, it's no longer just a Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York City problem. It used to be just a coastal city problem. That's where the zoning comes in, right? Like that's a historic thing that goes back to the 70s and 80s of downzoning. But now it's a national problem. In most counties, a minimum wage can't buy you a one-bedroom apartment. And yeah, part of that is because minimum wages haven't kept up with inflation, but it's also because of the fact that most cities genuinely are suffering from a housing shortage. We have a population that's added millions of people since just last 10, even 20 years ago, and production is not caught up. And so this is the counter-cyclical problem that we were trying to think about at East Bay for Everyone for years, which is what happens in the next recession when the housing production stops. And we don't even have to ask that question anymore. We saw that happen in 2020. Permits dipped. Did demand dip? Did baby births dip? No. But permits dipped because developers stopped building and lenders stopped, lending as soon as there was a downturn in rents. And so this is something that social housing, that the California Public Housing Corporation and many other proposals across the country are seeking to address, which is to make sure that we're building housing at a time when there's need and not at a time when lenders are most comfortable.
All right, now I could keep asking questions, and I will if things dip, but I'm sure there are a lot of questions in the room. There's a microphone up at the front, so I'm going to ask you if you have a question to come up and approach the microphone so that folks watching on the live stream can hear your question. All right, first question.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I also work with you all at California YIMBY, although we have not met yet. I'm pretty new. Curious what you all think, any of you, about what the biggest barriers are to actually winning social housing. What do you think are the biggest things that are going to get in our way?
Darrell, you want to take that one first, and then I'll kick it to Tiffany?
Okay, so the barriers are twofold. The first barrier to getting social housing is to get this bill passed and to get a financing model under control. Bureaucracy is pretty bad in a lot of places, especially in California. And there's a lot of interests that are not going to come out explicitly against social housing, but will try to sabotage it in their own ways. And we're going to have to be very vigilant about these types because we have a wide variety of people who ordinarily don't really agree with each other, all down for this social housing bill. And as more specifics comes up, as it goes through more committees, we're going to run into a lot of fiscal hawks. They're going to be like, we don't need more money into this. We're going to run into a lot of the nonprofit industry, which is like, hey, that's our job. We don't need the public sector to come back. And we're going to run into real estate interests that are going to be like, wait, we can't have public sector competing with us. And so then even when that's off the ground, the second problem is, let's say we get everything done, we get our financing done, so on and so forth. The second problem we're going to run into is the actual financing and operation of social housing. And I think this is really important. What a lot of people fail to understand about social housing models in Vienna and Singapore, we say it's not applicable here. Well, it is. It's just that it wouldn't be very efficient to do because we have two problems. Number one, these programs are being run at the state level when they really needed to be run at the federal level because we don't control the Treasury. So we can't afford to run into a deficit, right? So we're going to have to be a lot more fiscally balanced. And not only that, we're going to have to not rely on the federal government because relying on them is precisely what killed public housing in the first place. It was the federal government that killed public housing, regardless of whether localities wanted to do it. And the second problem is land costs. Land. It always comes back to land. The reason why social housing in places like Vienna and Singapore and even places like the Netherlands work so well is because the government owns a lot of land. And so they can cover land costs a lot more effectively than we can here. We've privatized all that. So the problem for even private developers is once you've gotten the land costs down, it doesn't become very financially feasible in even middle rent markets to build housing. You gotta wait till the rents skyrocket to very high incomes to start penciling housing because the land costs are so expensive. So it's gonna have to be a prerogative of the California Housing Agency to acquire land as much as it is to build housing because you can't really do one without the other.
Yeah, and Tiffani,
Yeah.
political obstacles?
Yeah, I would echo all of that. The main differences, I think, between the two campaigns is we're only doing this right now at the city level, and we're doing it through an initiative. So we need to go and gather 35,000 signatures by the end of June to get this on the November ballot, and then do a huge get out the vote drive. However, we've been out tabling in different communities in the city for like the past 2 months, and the response is like deeply overwhelming. Folks want this, they're desperate. We will turn out renters like in a very significant way. That's the base of who is going to like lift us up over that 51% vote in November. Also focusing on like folks that are on the brink of displacement or who have been displaced. Something that's really cool about like the initiative that we're working on is we actually are creating the public developer, which I said, but it's actually going to be a renter majority governing board. So we have 13 members on that governing board, and 7 of those are going to be renters. So this is like all of those different pipe dreams that Darrell and others always speak about, like, oh, the environment, or oh, union built, or oh, we have renter power. Like, we wanted to put all of those things together because they can be all done together. So that's what we're working on. So the obstacles are similar, like the financing. I'm not going to be able to say that better than Darrell. The other thing is, yeah, with nonprofit developers, like just making it very clear that we're not going after like their pie. Like the beauty of social housing is that we aren't going to be restricted by these federal financing cases. And so that's one. And also like, yeah, that we're not competing. And then, yeah, seeing if electeds will actually put forward money, that litmus test that Darrell brought up earlier. We set this up to have like in-kind support for the city for a couple of months, but we'll see if they fund it at a more significant level. That will be a hurdle. And then, I mean, more broad obstacles are we have to change zoning. We can't have this redlined historic zoning that we have in the city of Seattle. Those things go hand in hand. And then also we have a design review process here in Seattle that is just a killer of affordable housing projects and just like more density generally. So it is a huge campaign and it has multiple steps. We also need to pass a progressive revenue source to fund this. Washington is one of the most regressive states as far as taxation in the entire country, with Seattle being #1 for the most regressive taxation in the entire country. So we also need to work on a wealth tax or some other revenue source. So yeah, but I mean, we're like super eager to do it and excited, but those are real challenges, and we're not gonna like shy away from the zoning or the design review discussion during the campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned having tenant governance. That's an element of the California bill as well, right? Could you talk a little bit about some of the advantages of having that government structure in place in the social housing model?
It's crucial, actually. So our social housing model tries to do 2 things. It tries to be both a renter system and a homeowner system. Now, that's going to sound a little confusing. Homeowner, public housing, how does that work? Well, we are heavily inspired by the Singapore system of how they do public housing as far as ownership models. You know, Singapore is more than 80% people living in subsidized or social housing, and yet over 80% are homeowners. Well, how's that possible? It's because they have a really interesting system, which is essentially a lease system or a deed system where people become pseudo homeowners, where the state builds housing and then they sell them housing under 100-year leases. You can do what you want with your unit, you got 100 years, it was built by the state, it goes back in 100 years. This allows for people to build equity as homeowners while living in public housing that's publicly built and selling that housing and making in that equity. That's actually really good, especially when it comes to doing things that are public policies like closing the racial wealth gap in home ownership. If the state comes in and builds housing as a form of reparation, which is something we've talked a lot about with a lot of black groups around reparations, that would really be instrumental in closing the home ownership gap. And then on the tenant side, the renter side, for people who don't want to be homeowners under public housing. We've listened to a lot of tenant groups and organizations that said, look, the history of HUD housing was poverty warehousing where people had no control over what they wanted to do or what they were able to do. They couldn't even maintain their buildings. They couldn't, everyone knows the famous housing projects, Cabrini Green, so on and so forth, or, a lot of the issues in New York City. We don't want that to happen again. And mixed income housing is only part of it. The other part is that tenants have to have a voice. So we added a tenant council to the public housing bill to ensure that tenants would be represented by their government.
And Tiffany, is there a sort of limited home ownership model in the Seattle proposal as well?
Yeah, we put that, so we have two different sections. We have things that must happen under the public developer and then the should section. And the reason we separated those out is not because the should section is any less important. It's just that there are a lot of legal risks in what we wrote in there. So we wanted to put forward our vision and then have the board and the legal folks work that all out. So for instance, we're creating a lottery-based system for social housing units that come online because we didn't want to choose who gets it first. So and we wanted to make it as low barrier of an application process as possible, regardless of your criminal history or rental history or eviction history. So some of those were legally risky things. So we put that in the shoulds just to show our vision. And then we trust the renter majority board to carry these things out. So yeah, we have homeownership as a should. We did not feel comfortable getting into that whole model in the initiative just based on expertise and knowledge. So that is something we asked them to investigate and come up with their own model and pick and choose what works for them.
All right, who else has questions? You can also, we don't need to just feed people up here one at a time. If you have a question, you can come up closer to the mic.
Hi, Naki McMullen from Orlando YIMBY.
Sorry, could you speak closer into the mic?
Hi, Naki McMullen from Orlando YIMBY. Love the panel so far. I was just curious if you were willing to go more in depth into the financing side. I was curious if you thought this needs to happen, social housing needs to be funded on the federal level to happen at a scale enough to make a difference, or do you think state and local financing can also fund social housing enough to affect real change?
I mean, ideally, yes, the federal government would finance our housing system, but the problem is that the federal government is taken over by fiscal hawks like Republicans. We do not live in a democracy. We live in a pretty effed up country where people who are the minority of the vote still win regardless and then defund all of our programs despite paying taxes into them. So, I mean, that is the history of HUD. The history of HUD has been, building lots of subsidized housing projects which were income segregated, which were racially segregated, a perversion of the New Deal idea, and essentially tanked public housing. People always say, well, public housing failed. Well, no, it didn't. It was taken over by austerity people who ruined it. And so, yeah, we unfortunately, the point of this model is that it can't be, it can be welcome for federal funding, and of course HUD gives out grants, but it can't be solely dependent on federal funding because I cannot rely on another Donald Trump to kill all of our housing and displace everybody. So part of the social housing model that adopts from other countries is that this is not just the old projects where it is exclusively subsidized low-rent housing. There was a really good quote by an activist in Berlin when they were doing the appropriation vote saying, part of taking over housing isn't just that we want to have low-rent housing, it's that those rents, instead of going into the pockets of shareholders, goes instead to the pockets of people to build and maintain housing. And that's part of the social housing model here. So it's going to be a very interesting mix of incomes. You're going to have high-rent housing, and you're going to have low-rent housing. And a lot of the higher rent or market rent housing that is owned by the government, owned by the public, feeds not into the pockets of shareholders and back into investors to do whatever they want with it. It instead finances the construction construction of more low-rent housing. This is called cross-subsidized housing. And tax credits already do this to a smaller extent, but we're going to do it to a much larger extent. So this means that when public housing is being built for people who make, let's say, a family of $400,000 or $100,000 a year, that those rents are going to be paying for subsidized housing elsewhere, and they don't have to rely on, investor benevolence. That's part of it, and the other part is the initial cost to get the program running. We've talked a lot about acquisition of existing housing, which is really good because that means more land off the market, but it also is a debate between bonds versus grants. Grants are nice, you don't have to pay back grants, and we are going to need grants from the state government. But grants are also in limited supply. Everybody wants to do a lot of things with California's housing surplus, and it only pays for so much. So of course bonds are going to play a much heavier part. The Maryland system is more bond-based, whereas a lot more deficit-running systems like Singapore is a lot more grant-based. But again, they have a lot more federal support. So the point of this system's financing is the initial starting of the agency will depend on a mix of grants and bonds. Bonds have to be paid back, of course, but also that the revenue generation for this housing will make it self-sustainable. I kind of like to make a comparison to like college housing, but the only reason why I don't like that comparison is because whereas college housing rents go to serve education and other facilities, the rents here are going to serve more housing. And that's really where we want rents to go, to more housing and not to anything else.
I'm just going to, do you have a follow-up?
No, I was just saying great. If I could ask another follow-up, could you expand more on the entity that's going to control the social housing? Is it going to be similar to like current housing authorities, or would it be like a state-level entity?
Yeah, the proposal is to create an entity called the California Housing Agency, which would essentially just be the public developer and owner of housing in the state of California. I wouldn't be surprised if during the process in which it goes through a number of fiscal budget hawks and committee, it may just get wrapped up into the current existing California ACD, which basically manages like land use in the state of California. But regardless of what happens, the intent right now is to get the agency up and running with a mission and revenue ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to briefly editorialize here because as moderator, if I have a comment instead of a question, there's nothing you can do about it. We've talked a lot about the comparison between social housing and America-style public housing, and something I think both Darrell and Tiffani have alluded to, but that I want to kind of make explicit, is that the built environment of social housing really does not have to look like most people's mental image of public housing in the United States. It's sort of high-density Marcy projects in New York or Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. First of all, most public housing doesn't even look like public housing, if that's your definition of public housing. A lot of it is much lower density. But I just also wanted to highlight that there are a lot of different ways to build high-density social housing, and in other countries where this has been done, a lot of it is architecturally quite beautiful. So I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that.
Not to that specifically, but if I just may go back to the federal government aspect that the individual asked. The reality is, and I think we just need to embrace this, is that like no one in power is going to save us. It's us who is going to save us. We, regardless of like the most progressive folks that are elected into any level of government, they are one person against a huge capitalist system that is set up to do exactly what it's meant to do. This is not a broken system. This is how it's intended to run. Like Darrell said, like we are run not as a democracy at all. So we have to, like, as individuals who care about these issues, like organize with community and put things forward on the ballot if you can, or through committees and the state legislature if you have those friends. But just know that like for the climate crisis or or lack of transportation in this country, or like the ability to address homelessness, like this isn't going to come down from on top from any level of government. So while federal funding would be really, really nice, we can do this without that. And Montgomery County is a perfect example of how they are able to start pulling housing off the market to very high green energy standards with just that $3 million in annual revenue.
All right, Alex?
Hi, Alex Melendrez, organizing manager with YIMBY Action. We're actually a co-sponsor of the California Social Housing Act. I had to write down my question because I'm falling asleep. But so honestly, my question is kind of two-part, and it mostly revolves around public discourse. We're all a bunch of nerds here, and this kind of stuff sorry everybody, this is a policy we kind of jive with, we know this stuff, but what I'm interested in is like, what have either one of you found to be the public discourse around social housing, and how do you translate the beneficial policy of social housing to the people that it would serve?
Tiffany,
Yeah, I am happy to go on this one first, because Darrell and I have two different folks that we're trying to organize to win this. We're going directly to the voters of Seattle and focusing on people who are having to pay an extraordinary amount of rent or are behind in rent and our eviction moratorium is over and they don't really know how they're gonna pay rent in the future. Going to ordinary people and asking them if their material needs are met and sparking up a conversation that way is just like organic and beautiful. Or how much has your rent gone up? Have your wages gone up the exact same amount? How much longer do you have to be in the city? Like, it's going to those people and getting away from, as you said, nerds or folks that want to like really dive deep into the policy details. When you talk to ordinary workers and individuals, like even folks that are older living on SSI or SSDI, and they're not going to get an increase there. They don't want to be pushed out of the city. Like going and talking to them about how there is a housing model that could fit their needs to where they don't have to go further and further out of the city to have to drive 45 minutes to 60 minutes each way to work in the city to serve the rich. Like these are very resonating themes with regular everyday voters. So it's just getting out there and talking to people, not from like that technocratic aspect. That's important. We're talking to electeds about that. That's how we're going to get the funding. But for us with the initiative, it's going and talking to all of these renters and these folks that are impacted by these capitalist and market-based policies. And those are who we're going to be able to turn out to win. And we believe we will.
The California bill, of course, has the backing of the State Construction Workers Union. It has the backing of public sector unions, SEIU. It has the backing of California healthcare workers. It has the backing of a lot of working class groups and a lot more coming that I know but I can't say. So, I mean, it is very important to get the backing of ordinary people. And I think a lot of people in my discussions about them have actually been pretty well informed, even when I go into the technical aspects of it. When I tell people, I was just talking to reparations folks in California about the ownership element of social housing, and that really thrilled a lot of people, and they understood it very clearly. People were making comparisons to timeshare and all these things, and you know, this is very well, I mean, the policy wonk stuff's not even that complicated. Now, is there some level of discourse about the ways to really go about social housing in California? Yes, between certain groups about whether we should do much more of a traditional public housing system where it's just mostly focused on producing as much subsidized low-rent housing as possible, and the mixed-income model is kind of whatever, versus those who really think the mixed-income model is imperative to ensuring that it works this time. And I mean, this has actually been a huge debate. There's actually been a production versus acquisition element. I would say the production element is a lot more prominent, but there is certainly an acquisition people who don't really believe that there's a housing shortage and that the agency should just focus on acquiring housing only and not concern itself with development. I personally think that's not true at all, but that is what there has been some discourse around it. But by and large, for average people and for a lot of groups and organizations that are like with working people and are outside of the wonk world, there's been a lot of buy-in for social housing. But of course, we're not taking it to the people directly, we're taking it to representative democracy, and that can have its whole host of pitfalls and everything else. I will say if it doesn't work, we're gonna have to take it directly to the people anyways. Yeah, I mean, it has really collective buy-in so far.
Thank you. And I meant nerds as a compliment. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there is nothing wrong with being a nerd.
Hi, my name is Alex Omelovich. I'm New York City based. Big fan of you guys on Twitter. I wanted to say, first of all, that I think it's a really cool idea, and I encourage you guys to be creative and look to international models. I wanted to ask though that in New York City we do have a century of exploring many models of of kind of like, left approaches to the housing problem. A majority of our rental units are not market rate units. They're, either public through one form or rent regulated. For public ownership units, we have Mitchell Lama Limited Equity Co-ops. That's the kind of a successful form of middle income social housing that did not collapse the way that HUD housing did. We of course have our kind of Section 9 traditional NYCHA public housing, and then we have a public builder, the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, DASNY, and again, it's not that they do it's not like they do a bad job, but I'm curious, like, what problem could be solved by having something like DASNY building housing instead of having a contracting agency that is in charge of the financing and the mixing, but just putting it out to competitive tender to be built by any number of builders. So I have in mind, like, New York still builds social housing, but it's done by Housing Preservation and Development, a city agency. And so they have these tools like 420C or the Mix and Match program for 100% non-market new housing, but they put out a tender. So I'm curious, like, what problem does it solve to have the builder be public versus a manager and kind of competitive tender issuer? Yeah, thank you.
Darrell, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the, and I don't mean this in any kind of begrudging way, but that has been the sort of the neoliberal reform that you saw in places like Vienna, where you saw a lot of European public builders basically leave public building and say, we'll do ownership or whatever, we'll just outsource the development aspect to private developers. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with it per se. I think that the important thing really is to reduce the amount of numbers of contracts and numbers of hands that these projects go through. I used to work for a LIHTC developer, and I have a lot of experience working there, building LIHTC housing, mostly in Oakland, the Oakland metro area. And I remember, like, numerous projects. I think the worst project we ever worked on was when we remodeled a public housing building, trying to get a turnkey developer, which is the sort of middleman developer you mentioned, and then give it to the cooperative, community land trust, and it was a financial headache. The amount of hands that it trades, the amount of interest, the amount of lining up the finances, and the more complicated you make it, the higher the costs go up. So, I mean, since as I mentioned earlier, the real goal should be to have public ownership of land as much as we can to bring down land costs. Will there be situations where a public agency will rely on a turnkey developer? Sure, and that seems fine. I don't see, developers are not the problem, it's owning housing, that's the problem. That's financing housing, that's the problem. Developers just build houses, that's all they do. Most developers want to sell a building as soon as they build it. That's usually how it works. There's no problem insofar as that goes, but we want to make sure that the financing is pretty straightforward and that we're not caught up in any shoddy contractor work. And sadly, the truth is that America's not very good at building things. I mean, we put in subways backwards, and it takes us 10 years to, like, erect windmills. Our building capacity is just really shot compared to most of the world. This country is not very good at building multifamily housing either. If there's a suburban sprawl development, I might want to outsource that. But we've lost a lot of our contractors in missing middle housing in the recession. A lot of developers just, like, disappeared. Like, now you have all these big, like, luxury developers, but a lot of the, like, average neighborhood developers that would just build, like, a 3-story building with, like, 12 units in it, a lot of those people died in the recession. So, like, there is sort of a shortage in terms of skilled labor there as well. Or not skilled labor, but I guess skilled turnkey developers. Of course, California public housing will be union labor.
All right, Tiffani.
Yeah, and I would just add on to that, that from, like, going into the folks that are going from being unhoused into housing, like, the application process is incredibly onerous and also restrictive and classist and racist. And it takes a long time to do all of the applications necessary to get into the housing that is available right now through different affordable housing mechanisms. I mean, we all know that the wait lists at all housing authorities are bigger than we can imagine. And so those aren't getting any lower. And then also the timeline, like, this is something that is still, like, new to me, and it's really wild. All affordable housing units that are developed through LIHTC or Section 9 or any, like, city, even, like, put forward funds, those have a time limit on them. So there's a clock on all of those units that are affordable. They're not affordable in perpetuity. They're affordable for 30, 40 years, and then the individual that owns that building can then rent those out at market-based rents. So even though we're like building up this stock and like lawmakers pat themselves on the back for all of these investments, and while these are great, all of those units have like an expiration date on them, as if we're not going to need this deeply affordable housing in the future. So those are like three of the ways that like creating a public developer that owns this housing, builds it, maintains it, has renter input at the governing level, and even like tenant unions in each building that goes under the public developer is really important. And it's also like about creating like community and people power, and trying to make a 15-minute city, and having like healthcare clinics on the ground floor, childcare centers, et cetera. So we aren't getting to where we need to with all of our current neoliberal models, and they're not intended to get us to the deep affordability that we need at scale. So we need to do something else if we honestly want to address the housing affordability crisis and the climate crisis.
All right, next question.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name's Love. I live here in Portland. Thank you, Darrell, for being here. I'm a big fan of your writing, and thanks to the rest of you too. So I'm enjoying hearing about all the benefits of social housing, and I appreciated your points about like the cross-subsidy effect of having higher rent units as well. But I'm kind of wondering, like, if or how you see social housing as compatible with the targeted universalism approach that channels resources to people with the most need in order to improve the conditions of everyone, right? So I just have a hard time making the case for, like, if we're going to put a certain amount of public funds towards something, is this the thing that has the highest need? Like, is that compatible, or how do you think about that?
Tiffany, why don't you take that one first, sort of where social housing falls in terms of priorities?
Yeah, can I just ask a clarifying question to the questioner? Was it the universal approach that you were talking about specifically?
I was just referring to this concept of targeted universalism that says that, you know, if there's a problem, the way to improve the conditions for everyone, you know, the approach is to start with the people who have the most need, and then by solving the problems for that highest need group, you'll improve things for everyone else as well.
Thank you. No, that's helpful. So again, I think, and I'm sorry to be a broken record, but it really is like just this obvious, like, those are the highest need, but we're not going to get there through our current mechanisms. The federal government is not going to finance enough housing to address that 0 to 30 or 0 to 50% area media income. That's just, we have to accept that. The social housing developer that we're putting forward here in Seattle would serve those that make between 0% of the area media income up to 120% of the area media income. This is like your workforce and your low income housing. These are your custodians, your childcare providers, your bus drivers, your nurses, your teachers, all folks who are always on the precipice of needing to move out of the city to somewhere that's more affordable, and then take up that huge commute every day to get into the city to do their jobs. So that's the model that we're putting forward, so it's not like all the way up to however much AMI there is in the city of Seattle. As the tech bros, as they call themselves in our coalition, say, every time an Amazon worker comes to Seattle, the AMI goes up. So none of our current mechanisms or interventions are ever going to serve those needs of those 0 to 30 or 0 to 50. And social housing is a way that we can actually do that and prevent the pipeline into homelessness, which I think is really, really important to make sure that we talk about as well.
Yeah, so that's the sort of big debate between sort of the European-style cross-subsidy version versus the old-school American projects, right? Do you just build lots of like low-rent housing and then just put everyone in it, and that sort of will build up from the bottom? I think that the problem with when we talk about universalism, I mean, if I make the comparisons to healthcare, for example, that covers everybody, irrespective of income, and the best countries on earth with single payer or national universal healthcare. Housing at various rental models, people tend to think of as giving public dollars away to those people, but it's really not. It's in a way a form of progressive taxation because those rents are serving low-income households. So it's not just a matter of like, because I get what people are saying. People are going to go, well, why should we spend public dollars housing middle-class families? I think that like there's two aspects to this. If you don't, you get sort of a weird place like San Francisco or increasingly New York, where you essentially have like very poor people who can like luck their way into on a lottery, and rich people and your average working class people essentially can't get out. Too rich for subsidies, too poor for the market, right? So I think that those are all part of our need. And not to sort of use sort of socialist terminology, but like I don't want to create sort of class divisions in terms of like which groups are more necessary and which ones aren't. Obviously, there are people who imminently need immediate low-income housing, and we obviously want to focus on those groups. But like the key reason why public housing died in the United States is because it failed to create a collective class interest. When it became something that was only for warehousing the poor and something that middle-class people should not concern themselves with, that's why it was popular and cheered for all those public housing towers to get demolished, because it was viewed as other people's housing. And I think that the lesson from mixed income social housing models is that when everyone is collectively invested into housing at all income levels, and we have the same system with healthcare, that people then actually care about these things more rather than segmenting it off. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on low-income households. It should. That the whole goal here is to make sure that we can finance those low-income households, but we can't, like, I think, postpone certain income groups and say, okay, you wait later, because then I just don't think we'll ever get there.
Thank you.
And Tiffany, you mentioned homelessness in particular in your answer to the last question. Could you expand a little bit about how you see social housing addressing homelessness specifically?
Yeah, so maybe this terminology is a bit universal, but bear with me, like this pipeline into homelessness. So we know that evictions more often than not lead directly into homelessness. And we know that study after study says that for like every $100 rent increase in urban areas, it's like this broad range of like 20 to 60% of folks will become unhoused because they just can't keep up with the rent. So we have, all of our current affordable housing strategies and models, but we don't have a significant focus on how to prevent that pipeline into homelessness. Our focus is always on the short term. So it's like on shelters and tiny house villages and 24/7 shelters or hotels, which these are great. These are important. We need to take care of people outside right now and do that harm reduction. But we don't have any plans to actually prevent homelessness from happening. Like this is a purely like economic and cultural phenomenon, homelessness is. And if you're able to provide housing that is based on people's incomes and not have them be rent burdened and having to decide between like buying that like extra thing for their kids' birthdays versus rent, especially during the pandemic, this really exacerbated under there, like folks will be able to be more stably housed. I mean, talking specifically to like El Centro de la Raza and the Ethiopian Community Services here in Seattle, like the mental toll that it takes on their communities to not know if they're going to be able to pay rent or what the rent increase will be year after year, like it's intense. So we know that eviction and rent increases and market-based solutions do lead to homelessness. So instead of just focusing on rental subsidies that really just subsidize the private market, we should be building up housing as a human right that is based on individuals' incomes so that they have that there all the time.
That's actually a really good point, and I actually wanted to kind of expand on that further. One of the key differences between our proposal for public housing, social housing in California, and the existing tax credit-based system is that you're allowed to have savings. You're allowed to have higher incomes eventually. People don't know this, but most people don't live in subsidized housing, and a lot of people who would qualify for subsidized housing don't even want to apply for it, because even if you get your unit, like you're only means tested at the start, and you're means tested the entire time you're in housing. This is another very neoliberal, actually this isn't even neoliberal, because neoliberal is the 80s. This is just sort of the segregationist stuff that came out of the anti-black racist New Deal policies, where public housing went from something that came in the Depression era to, sort of keep up with the lack of housing production to temporarily embarrass private housing residents. The goal of public housing was always to get people out of it eventually. And so even subsidized housing now, the tax credit model, if you make too much money, you're out, right? I mean, I know we're generally talking about people who are income stratified, but like we want people to, poverty comes first and foremost from the lack of housing. People always get it twisted, right? If you want to get people off of addiction and stuff, they need to have housing first and foremost. And so what's key about social housing is, yeah, there's going to be means testing for the lowest income units when the unit is first on and a occupant is found. But afterwards, it's okay for that occupant to make more money and have a better established life and be successful and not just kicked out onto the private market. This is not transitional housing. We want this to be housing that is permanent. And that is a very key difference between our proposed public housing model versus the existing nonprofit tax credit system.
I can't resist coming in here again because some of you might know that homelessness policy is part of my whole thing. And it's important to note that for preventing homelessness, vouchers and subsidies for housing are proven to be extremely effective, especially HUD did a 3-year study on families experiencing homelessness and found that permanent housing subsidies were the most effective and also fairly cost-effective response to making sure that they get housed again and remain housed. Temporary subsidies, the evidence there is much worse. So if you're looking for a financially sustainable way to not just prevent homelessness, but make sure that people who previously experienced homelessness are able to stay housed for the long term, then permanent subsidies through something like social housing are a good way to do it. Another question for both of you. Somewhat remarkably, we've managed to get through this entire panel so far without talking about NIMBYs head on. And curious for each of these proposals, what sort of mechanisms are available to make sure that that neighborhoods in the case of Seattle or NIMBY cities in the case of California can't just block social housing from being developed, even if the legal mechanisms to build social housing are in place? Maybe I'll have Darrell answer that one first.
So I don't know if you guys know this, but in California, public housing is technically kind of banned under the California Constitution, Article 34, which says that it requires a voter referendum to build public housing in your city. They found ways around this in the nonprofit world, but I've actually, as someone who used to work in light tech, this was a real problem. I used to work on Article 34 litigation. We tried to build housing in Marin County, and Article 34 litigation came up time and time again. This was passed by the real estate industry to make sure that public housing development in the 50s would stop, and it did. That's why we don't have a lot of old school projects like the East Coast does. And so, there's been a lot of talk in terms of like, should the public housing agency have zoning preemption? And we've talked about things we could do as far as like density bonuses. I work with existing zoning codes. Look, California just got rid of single family zoning and it was quite contentious. People are a little exhausted right now. If we make an agency that can ignore zoning, that would be kind of tough. But hopefully, the final version of the bill is going to go through a lot of iterations. I hope to see something like that on there because it really is key. A lot of our public builders, like colleges and universities, aren't confined by zoning, and they actually decently do an all right job building housing for their students. It seems kind of impractical to make housing abide by existing zoning. Otherwise, it would just be as segregated and inefficient as the light tech industry currently is.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but AB 2053 includes language that would allow the California Housing Authority to sue cities, right?
I believe so, but I'll have to verify that. I don't want to say anything to get me in trouble.
Fair enough. All right, Tiffany?
Yeah, that definitely should have been one of those political hurdles in that question you asked us earlier. That's very, very real. Yeah, that's why like mobilizing renters and folks that will be Yeah, we always talk about like building movements, but really in order to like combat the weaponization of like our environmental processes here, which have been used by like white neighborhood women in the city over and over to like block tent cities from being able to be stood up. We're just gonna have to like build a movement to pressure the city council to not fall under these traps. And then also we have our like comprehensive plan coming up this next year or two in the city of Seattle. So making a huge campaign out of that and really getting into like how racially segregated and like income segregated the city is, and putting all electeds like on their back foot to have to basically stand up for why they want to maintain that. Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have like a very concrete answer. We just have to build people power, and that's what we want to do throughout this initiative and all the other efforts.
All right, we have time for 2 to 3 more questions. We have about, oh, no, we don't. We're supposed to wrap up. Okay, well, one more very quick question for both of you, because Tiffani, I know you work at a newspaper, and Darrell, I believe you mentioned something about a Substack. So just quickly, where can we find both of you online and the work you do?
Sounds like most people know where to find Darrell, but Darrell, go ahead.
You could just Google my name, Darrell Owens. If you go to my Twitter, unfortunately my Twitter account, I should really make a website, but my Twitter account has the link to my Substack in the bio, where I do a lot more in-depth writing. My Twitter account is just to react to things, but if you actually want to see me think about things, that's what my Substack is located, and I really do go into depth in the complexities of these housing issues.
And yeah, I work at the street paper Real Change, but I have nothing to do with the editorial department. They are their own entity. I just work on the advocacy department with our vendors and community partners to push forward progressive and radical policy. But yeah, I'm on Twitter too, but I don't think it's worth following me.
All right, and on that note, let's give them both a round of applause.
How long do I have to? It's still on.
That was great. Thank you. I'm really glad I.